The title of tonight's lecture is The Clown That Conquered the World, How Globalization and Ronald McDonald Remade the World That We Live in Today. I have two tasks tonight, two tasks. Does this work?
It does when I'm not clicked in Zoom.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I have two tasks tonight. First, I'll be describing in broad strokes one of the biggest trends in the world in the last 50 years or so, and that is globalization. I'll loosely define here what globalization is. I'm going to define it as basically the dramatic integration of the world's economies as diverse groups of people around the world have begun sharing their goods and services, and as a consequence, also their ideas, values, information, art, literature, in short, their culture, to a degree and at a pace much greater than they ever have been before. And second, I'm going to be talking about the cultural impact of that process. I'm going to try to describe how I believe diverse groups of people around the world have reacted to globalization, sometimes embracing it, sometimes rejecting it, and sometimes attempting to negotiate the terms of their integration with the wider world in ways more acceptable to them. And also how all of those reactions find expression in the cultural products that people around the world make and consume every day. And one of the key paradigms that I'll be using to analyze the cultural impact of globalization is something called McDonaldization, which is a concept associated with an American sociology professor by the name of George Reitzer, which also obviously takes its name from the world's most popular restaurant found in more than 120 countries today. And that is, of course, we all know what that is. McDonald's, right? Okay, first let's talk about the origins of globalization. Let's get into it. Before I can talk about the impact of globalization, I need to briefly address where it comes from. Well, as with any big picture trend in human history, and a few of you are my students, so you know, Brennan, Joel, is Dr. Hernando a fan of monocausal explanations?
No.
No, he is not. They know this very well. As with any big picture trend in human history, globalization has a variety of factors contributing to it. One of them is decolonization. Simply put, from the end of World War II through in other words, from about 1945 to the end of the 20th century, the various European colonial empires that had been built up over the preceding couple of centuries rapidly disintegrated. How did decolonization contribute to globalization? Well, because most of those colonial empires profited off of their colonies by strictly controlling their economies, including who they could trade with, what products they could import, what products they could export, and so on. Great example of this that I use in a lot of my classes is India under the British Empire. For centuries, India had a very sophisticated, very skilled textile industry. But under the British Empire, they became a supplier of raw cotton. Period. Full stop. That was all that they were allowed to do. They were actually forced to import finished textiles from the British textile industry, and they were forbidden from manufacturing their own. And so in the process, that destroyed the sophisticated native textile industry that had been in place for centuries before British rule. As those colonial empires unraveled then, the people groups that they had subjugated were now free to begin interacting economically with many parts of the world that had been closed off to them, and consequently were also able to interact culturally with people groups that they had had very little interaction with before. Another contributing factor, okay, there we go. Another contributing factor is the end of the Cold War. Like decolonization, the end of the Cold War also had a significant impact on globalization. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent Communist China, exercised a strong degree of control over governments and economies of a number of their satellite states, the Eastern Bloc in Europe and their relationship with the Soviet Union, for example, or the relationship between, let's say, North Korea and China. The people groups in those regions, therefore, were generally not allowed to interact they were not allowed to interact economically with the West. They also weren't allowed to interact culturally with the supposedly decadent peoples outside the communist sphere. For a long time, for example, the Soviet Union banned most forms of Western art, including rock and roll, blues, jazz, also most Western movies from being distributed in the countries within their orbit. It was actually illegal to watch any of the Chuck Norris movies in the old Soviet space. Despite these restrictions, people in the Eastern Bloc sometimes went to hilarious lengths to access Western cultural products, as evidenced by the 2015 documentary Chuck Norris versus Communism. And if you want to spend an hour, immersing yourself in glorious 80s nostalgia, I can tell you that's a great place to start. I actually have the trailer embedded in that image, but we don't have time to watch it tonight. After the Cold War, these restrictions are generally lifted, and the cultural exchange between the Soviet/communist space, and the West resumed. Another contributing factor beginning during the Cold War, but accelerating afterward, has been the triumph of economic globalization, particularly in the form of free trade throughout most of the world over the last 40 to 50 years or so. And this country, the United States, has been the number one, by far, major instigator of this change. If the story of economic globalization begins anywhere, if it has a birthplace, it's probably this unassuming hotel located in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Has anybody ever been skiing in New Hampshire? I have. Okay, a couple of you. If you ever get the chance, I highly recommend you go to this hotel. I can't afford it myself. I've driven by there, but I can tell you they still have, if you go to the hotel, they still have the names of the countries that stayed in each room in that hotel. But anyways, this is the Mount Washington Hotel, the Bretton Woods Ski Resort. And in 1944, representatives from 44 nations, get that, 1944, 44 nations, met at a ski resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and they hammered out an agreement on currency exchange that pegged the member states' currencies to the dollar, which was in turn pegged to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. This was invalidated when Nixon took the United States off the gold standard in 1971. It also created two institutions that are still with us today, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Gold Star, if any of you know the more colloquial name for that institution. We call it the World, say it? Bank. World Bank, yeah, that's exactly right, the World Bank. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, conducts economic research with all of the 190 member countries. They also serve as a lender of last resort to nations going through fiscal and economic crises. The World Bank was created to provide financial assistance in the form of loans for the reconstruction of war-ravaged nations and the economic development of less developed nations. The original impetus for it was, of course, the economic crisis in Western Europe following World War II. This was a corollary effort to the Marshall Plan and all of that. Next major event that I want to talk about would be NAFTA, 1992. Eliminated, that's North American Free Trade Agreement, eliminated all tariffs and trade barriers among the United States, Canada, and Mexico, basically turning the entirety of North America into a free trade zone. Passed Congress with bipartisan support. Actually, it was championed by then Democratic President Bill Clinton, but actually more Republicans than Democrats both voted for it, so it was truly bipartisan. Then in 1994, the U.S. Senate ratified the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. This was a major international treaty signed by 135 nations around the world and established the World Trade Organization to basically be the watchdog on free trade around the world. It enforces substantial limits on tariffs and trade regulations among member nations, among other things. All of this has come with pretty undeniable economic benefits, not just for the United States, but for the world as a whole. For example, it's led to an extreme reduction in global poverty. This is probably the biggest impact. The biggest impacts of this can be seen in developing countries like in South Asia, Africa, South America, etc. According to the World Bank, over a roughly 30-year period from 1985 to 2015, the global extreme poverty rate, defined as people living on less than $2 a day, basically, fell by more than half. Although it should be mentioned that that momentum seems to have stalled in the wake of COVID. Extreme poverty has actually inched up a little bit in the last few years. More on that near the end of our talk. And then the last major contributing factor to globalization has been the advent of the information age, which is the term given to the revolution in information sharing brought on by the advent of modern telecommunications technology, particularly the internet and or television and or social media. And this has made it possible for people around the world to share ideas, information, values, and cultural products more or less instantaneously with whoever around the world wishes to access those products. So the classic example of this would be the American sitcom I Love Lucy. How many of you love Lucy? Very good, yeah. It's been dubbed into 22 different languages and it's in syndication in 77 nations around the world today. Okay, this is where I find out who my millennials in the class are. This picture, who is this and what show is he from?
The Office.
The Office. This is Steve Carell's Michael Smith from The Office.
Michael Scott.
Did I say Michael Smith?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got you.
Have to be punished. Yeah, I am actually an Office aficionado, but it's been a while since I did I have a 15-month-old at home, so I don't have that much time for television anymore. Of course, how many of you know what The Office, the American version of The Office, is based off of? Right?
Was it just like, it was just the American, we don't have the British version?
Yeah, there was a British version from, I don't have the dates in front of me, but I want to say 2002 to 2005, something like that. It only ran for 3 seasons. It was on the BBC, so like 4 episodes a season. You all know how the BBC works. It was kind of a cult hit over in Great Britain. It turned into a massive hit here in the United States. It's one of those rare scenarios where the remake was actually much better than the original. Ricky Gervais would probably punch me in the face for saying that, but it ran for 9 seasons and it had over 200 episodes, and the list of awards that it won is as long as your arm, and it's one of the few millennial TV shows that Gen Z still loves and follows intensely. A third example would be the tremendous popularity of stand-up comedy in the Middle East today, made possible by a very popular, it's actually the #1, the most popular social media platform in the world. Does anybody know what the most popular social media platform in the world today is? YouTube. Facebook is #2. YouTube actually gets more daily hits or daily usage, however you want to find it, than than even Facebook does. There's a really, I'm only gonna play one clip in this class. Rusty, could you hover your mouse over that, guys? Yeah, go ahead, click there. Click there. Yeah. So I'm gonna play this one clip.
Okay. And for me, it's not okay because I researched Saudi Arabia. And you think the rules in Singapore are strict. The rules in Saudi Arabia are very, very different. Okay. And I don't want to offend anyone. And I want to make sure that I don't say the wrong thing. So I need to know, I need some info. So I keep talking to the driver. Sir, would you mind helping me with some questions? Whatever you need, you ask, I tell you. It's okay.
Crank it up, crank it up. Turn it
I
back.
apologize in advance if I come across rude or disrespectful.
There we go.
I said, excuse me, sir, where's this guy? He's okay. Hey, take it to him. He's okay. He's okay. He's okay. Okay. And for me, it's not.
Okay. So what Fluffy is going to be describing here is a comedy tour that he did in Saudi Arabia, and how he touched down in Saudi Arabia, and he was surprised to learn that he was actually already immensely popular in Saudi Arabia via YouTube. Okay, you can hit play.
Not okay because I researched Saudi Arabia, and you think the rules in Singapore are strict. The rules in Saudi Arabia are very, very different. Okay, and I don't want to offend anyone, and I want to make sure that I don't say the wrong thing. So I need to know, I need some info. So I keep talking to the driver. I said, sir, would you mind helping me with some questions? Whatever you need, you ask, I tell you. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I apologize in advance if I come across rude or disrespectful or ignorant, but how do you guys know about me here in the Middle East? What do you mean, how do we know? Yeah, how do you know that I'm a comedian? Do you have Comedy Central or HBO or Showtime? What is that? That's a no. That's what that is. That's a no. How do you know that I'm an entertainer? Oh, your videos, YouTube. My friend, YouTube, you're huge. You're the #2 most famous comedian in all of the Middle East. #2. You're kidding. I am not comedian. I don't kid. No. I'm the #2 most famous comedian in all of the Middle East? Yes! Who's #1? Jeff Dunham. Jeff Dunham is the #1 comedian in the Middle East. You guys don't find him at all offensive? Oh, no. I kill you.
Pause it there. If you know why that's funny, we can be friends. I just want to- So, and that's a good place to segue into talking about the cultural impact of globalization, which also brings us to George Reitzer's McDonaldization thesis. In 1993, Reitzer published the first of what seems like 4,700 editions of his seminal book, The McDonaldization of Society, in which he propounded his famous McDonaldization thesis. And the basic idea is that at the dawn of the new century, Reitzer believed that, and this is a quote from him, from the book, the principles of the fast food restaurant are coming to dominate more and more sections of American society as well as the rest of the world, end quote. In particular, Reitzer saw the world as being transformed by 4 underlying principles often associated with McDonald's and also its many imitators throughout the fast food industry and other industries. One of them was efficiency, elimination of all wasted expense or effort. This applies to both workers and customers. People go to McDonald's basically to go from being hungry to full as fast as possible and with as little expense and effort as possible. That's why people go to McDonald's. Calculability. Everything gets measured from the size of the buns and the patties to the scoops used to serve a large, medium, or small French fries, to the amount of time each patty stays on the grill, the number of pickles that go on each burger, everything gets measured. Number three, predictability. People go to McDonald's because they know exactly what to expect when they go to McDonald's. No surprises. That's why they go there. When walking in, they already have a good idea of how much money they're going to spend, how much time they're going to stay there, what their burger and fries or their McChicken sandwich is going to taste like. It's the same everywhere you go, whether you're in Florida or New York or Arizona or California. There might be tiny little local or regionalized differences, but it's the same everywhere you go, unless you go overseas. More on that in a bit. But predictability, big part of their recipe for success. And then lastly, control. McDonald's wants to sell as many burgers as possible to as many people as possible. So to accomplish that, they attempt to control the business process as much as possible through two primary methods. Number one is aggressive regimentation, and number two is the implementation of technology, right? So regimentation means they impose lots of rules, and then they also use technology to limit the amount of labor and cost and time it takes to fulfill their task. So a great example of this is something that if you've been to McDonald's, how many of you have been to McDonald's in the last week? Really? I've been there like twice today. Okay. Why did you all come to this? Anyway, I think this is a good place to insert the famous, you all know the really tall, pale comedian. Does a lot of jokes about food. So, why am I forgetting? Also, he jokes about being Catholic. Anyway.
That's what I was thinking.
No. He's older than that. He has a riff about, there's a comedian who has a riff about McDonald's, and he said, the theme of it is everybody says that they don't eat at McDonald's, but they sell 1 billion hamburgers a day. Jim Gaffigan. I'm not a mathematician, but I think everybody is lying. Anyways, so what was I going to say there? Yeah, the touchscreen kiosks is what I was giving as an example of control. The touchscreen kiosks. They're present in almost every location. It allows the customers to plug in exactly the order that they want without having to talk to a real person if they don't want to. A real person, after all, might take too long to complete the order, also might mess up the order, so that eliminates that possibility altogether. All right, so that's what McDonaldization means in general. But the term also has a secondary meaning when used in talking about globalization. In that context, in the context of globalization, the basic idea is that Western, especially American, cultural hegemony has led to a worldwide global or worldwide homogenization of cultures that has been accelerated due to the success of economic globalization. So in other words, with the triumph of this American system of free trade and global economic interconnectedness has come American cultural control or preeminence, which has subtly encouraged, if not coerced, non-Western cultures into adopting Western standards. As Reitzer puts it, McDonaldized systems must be standardized. They cannot help but impose themselves to some degree on local markets. Moreover, because McDonaldization was first an American phenomenon, it's no surprise that the changes it has wrought around the world are often perceived as evidence of cultural imperialism by the United States. As Thomas Friedman put it in his 1999 book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, globalization has a distinctly American face. It wears Mickey Mouse ears, eats Big Macs, it drinks Coke or Pepsi, and it does its computing on an IBM or Apple laptop. Understanding that globalization and McDonaldization are often seen as tools of American cultural imperialism also helps us to understand the many and varied reactions to these processes that we see unfolding throughout the world, and how those reactions find expression through the cultural products that people create and or use on an ongoing basis. So one of those reactions to globalization slash McDonaldization is the whole concept of rejection. And here it often takes the form of anti-Westernism or anti-Americanism. Essentially, it involves a complete rejection of American and Western cultural influence as being somehow corrupting or degrading to non-Western cultures and traditions that it encounters. This is particularly common among people groups in parts of the world that perceive themselves as being culturally opposed to the United States. And a great example of that would be much of the Middle East. So, for example, this idea of cultural rejection finds expression in the worldwide phenomenon that we've dealt with a lot, particularly over the last 25, 30 years or so, of international terrorism. It's important not to overgeneralize too much about the causes of terrorism, but it is clear that at least one of the common motives behind many recent Islamic terrorist movements has been a resentment or rejection of corrupt Western cultural influence. A report by Stanford University's Hoover Institution, for example, found that radicalized youth in the Netherlands often saw themselves as, quote, rebelling against what they perceive as culturally contaminated soft Islam as practiced by their parents and promoted in the local mosque, preferring instead a purer version of Islam that they largely discovered online. The vast majority of Muslims, it cannot be emphasized enough, do not belong to terrorist groups, but the sense that Western mores and Western values are somehow corrosive to Islamic values extends far beyond them. A good example of this would be the Pakistani poet Muhammad Iqbal, one of the more famous Islamic poets from the pre-World War II era, and his poem, Europe and Syria, 1936, in which he blames Europe, which he's using as basically a metaphorical stand-in for the West, including the United States, for being a corrupting influence on the purity of Islamic culture. So there's this passage here that I like to quote, which gives a good illustration of this theme. This land of Syria gave the West a prophet of purity and pity and innocence. And Syria from the West, as recompense, gets dice and drink and troops of prostitutes. By the way, the prophet of purity and pity and innocence is a reference to who? It is a reference to Jesus, exactly. It's a reference to Jesus, who is mentioned in the Quran as well as the Bible, obviously. We'll start for you, Brendan. Another example would be the Syrian poet Adonis. That's his pen name, not his real name. And his 1986 poem, A Grave for New York. This poem, originally in Arabic, but translated in English in later years, uses New York as a metaphorical stand-in for the whole United States, mocking American pretensions to being a champion of liberty while smothering the freedom of others and engaging in economic exploitation and environmental degradation. A good example of this would be this little excerpt, and the whole poem is like 10 pages long, so I'm giving you a tiny little snippet here, but I think it conveys a sense of the emotion or ethos that it's trying to convey. New York, a woman, the state of a woman, lifting in one hand a rag called liberty by a document called history, and with the other hand suffocating a child called earth. Adonis, it should be noted, has spent most of his, I think he's still alive, I'm pretty sure he's still alive, most of his entire adult life living mainly in the West, especially Paris, leading some critics to suggest that his anti-Westernism may be insincere, but that's neither here nor there. Still another example would be the Egyptian author Yusuf Idris and his novella, his short story, New York 80. And this tells the story of an unnamed Egyptian man who we think is probably a stand-in for the author himself, who comes to New York in 1980, around the same time that Idris himself came there. He meets an American woman named Pamela Graham in a bar and strikes up a very engaging conversation with her. They connect, they have like an instant chemistry. In the course of that conversation, he discovers that she has a Ph.D. in psychology and used to work as a therapist, but, this is the big reveal, has recently changed professions to become a prostitute for the simple reason that it pays better. There's a not so subtle critique implied here of Western morals, particularly greed and materialism. One of the funnier aspects from that short story that I've always found to be humorous is, despite her current line of work, she always envisions getting back into academia, back into publishing, and so she's in the habit of lugging around her dissertation from one assignation to the next, looking for a publisher. We've all been there, right? A second response, not quite as dramatic as the first, would be protest. So we have rejection, then we have protest. The protest response basically entails not necessarily a complete rejection of Western cultural influence, but a recognition that integration within particularly globalized and Americanized systems has come with some real cultural costs that need to be taken seriously. In particular, some artists and writers have highlighted how participation in global markets has resulted in local forms of artistic and cultural expression becoming submerged into a broader kind of homogenized or Americanized global culture, which is, again, basically the McDonaldization thesis as it applies to globalization. So a good example of this is Japanese artist Yasumasa Morimura's Portrait Futago. Now, if you know anything about art history, I probably should have divided these two slides. I should have divided these two slides because it would have been more effective. Note to self for the future. But this first painting is an obvious spoof or takeoff of what? Of the second, right? This is Edouard Manet's Olympia, which is associated with the European art movement called realism. And so Muramura is basically spoofing it here. The scene is virtually the same, except that the artist in this case inserts a portrait of himself into the painting, wearing a blonde Marilyn Monroe wig, as well as makeup, in the classic boudoir pose of Manet's high-class prostitute. Interestingly, he also inserts his own face onto that of the black maid. So you see his face here, but you also see his face here as well. What's he trying to say here? Well, one clue can be found in the name of the painting. Futago is Japanese for twin. Japanese for twin, suggesting that Muramura is identifying himself as a twin of Fu. Not necessarily Manet, maybe Manet, but he's a twin of the prostitute, and also of the servant slash slave in this painting. Some commentators have suggested that he is basically satirizing the tendency of Asian artists to copy the style and the method of great artists from the Western canon, right? And so in the process, they prostitute or enslave themselves to a Western foreign artistic tradition. There's a lot more to unpack there in that painting. I don't have time to unpack it all. Take my Humanities 242 class if you want to learn a little bit more. Another example comes from, and I'm probably going to butcher this guy's last name, apologies, Wang Guangyi, Coca-Cola, titled Coca-Cola, 1993. You see a similar type of nuance here as in Portrait from Chicago. The painting, pretty clearly, and if you know anything about art under communist governments, there's something called socialist realism. It's very popular in Mao's China, very popular in Stalin's Soviet Union. It's basically art that serves the state, especially for propaganda purposes. So they often depict like muscular, energetic peasants and workers waving flags and, you know, happily going about their business, happily going about their work, bravely defending the fatherland or the motherland from foreign adversaries. So that it obviously mimics the style of socialist realism in that regard, except that the workers in this case are brandishing not a flag, but a what? What is this? Huh?
Fountain pen.
Fountain pen / flagpole. Like it's kind of both, right? But yeah, the bottom of it is definitely in place of a flag pen, which seems to be poised downward towards what? The Coca-Cola logo, the most famous corporate logos in the world. Now, they could be seen as stabbing the Coca-Cola logo, suggesting a violent rejection of Western cultural influence. But at the same time, what else do you do with the pen? I mean, unless you're Jason Bourne, you probably don't stab people, right? What do you usually do with a pen? Right. So it can also be seen as kind of authoring the Coca-Cola logo onto a crimson red background, which is evocative of what flag?
Yes, sorry.
Chinese flag of the People's Republic of China. The fake serial numbers painted all over the canvas also subtly suggest that Chinese artists who create such art have effectively sold out to the West. So there's a variety of layers of potential meaning to this, and probably intends all of them. Still another response would be what I have called accommodation or hybridization. And essentially this involves a recognition that you're going to participate in a globalized culture no matter what. You're going to participate in a globalized culture no matter what. That is the world that we live in. It's been fundamentally, irrevocably transformed by these global economic systems. And so you may as well make the most of it by borrowing from the artistic styles, motifs, and mediums of other cultures and combining them with elements from one's own culture to create something fresh and new and exciting. So a really good example of that, give you a plethora of examples, but a really good example of this is the Ghanaian artist from Ghana, El Anatsui. He's considered to be one of the foremost sculptors in modern day Africa, one of listed awards as long as your arm. And his probably one of his most famous sculptures, Between Heaven and Earth. And it consists of literally thousands of aluminum seals and wine and liquor bottle caps and so on. In other words, junk that have been woven together with copper wire to create a shimmering metal tapestry. And the design, and he's done a lot of these tapestries. This is just one of the more prominent examples. But the design of this tapestry is deliberately reminiscent of the designs found in traditional African, especially Ghanaian, Kente textiles. Kente textiles consist of hand-woven strips of multicolored cotton and or silk. They're often worn like togas by leaders for ceremonial occasions and so on. And Anatsuri's work is suggestive of an alternative paradigm for Reitzer's McDonaldization thesis, which some scholars call heterogenization or hybridization. And the basic idea here is that rather than creating a uniform global McDonaldized culture, what globalism really does is allow local cultures to take elements from other cultures and adapt them to suit their own purposes. So they don't become homogenized, rather they hybridize. They hybridize with other cultures. And a great example of this, of course, brings us back to McDonald's. Proponents of the hybridization interpretation point to the fact that, yes, there's a McDonald's in almost every modern developed country today. But if you look at their menu, what they actually serve is vastly different. They kept the name, they kept the golden arches. But once you go inside the doors, everything else looks, and especially tastes, very, very different. So for example, if you were to go to a McDonald's in the Philippines, which I've been to the Philippines 3 times, and I've eaten at McDonald's by the way, one of my pastimes, anytime I go overseas, if at all possible, I try to go to McDonald's in that country. I'm that committed to my research. If you go to a McDonald's in the Philippines, one of the more popular dishes is mixed spaghetti, which is spaghetti noodles served with a sweetened tomato sauce with Frankfurter bits and a side of fried chicken. If you go to Uruguay, you can order huevos, which is a hamburger with a poached egg on top. If you go to Norway, you can order McLats, which is a grilled salmon sandwich with dill sauce. In Russia, one of the more famous desserts at the Russian version of McDonald's is a chocolate mousse with dark chocolate shavings. Here. Unfortunately, you can no longer get that because in the wake of the Russia-Ukrainian war, all McDonald's locations across Russia have been closed down. Wrong. So sad. How that did not immediately bring an end to Putin's invasion of Russia, I will never understand. I could not go and get my chocolate mousse set. I would riot in the streets. I tell you that right now. And all of that brings us to my recent trip to Italy. Over the past summer, my wife and my boy and I, we took a trip to Bra, it's the town of Bra, which is located near Torino, Italy. My wife is Albanian, but most of her family now lives in Italy, in that area. And so we were going to see family. And while I was there, I took a trip with my sister-in-law's husband, spell his name Bouillard. He had no idea why we were going to McDonald's. To his understanding, why on earth would an American come to Italy in order to eat at McDonald's? And the answer is because I'm so committed to my research, right? But he was a good sport about it, and he drove me to the local McDonald's. It was a McDonald's 20 minutes away in Sevigliano, I believe it's pronounced, Italy. And at a McDonald's in Italy, one of the first things that you see when walking in the door are these beautiful pastry display cases with all kinds of delicious artsy fartsy pastries and croissants and donuts and macaroons and even tiramisu. Yes, in Italy, you can get tiramisu at McDonald's. Why can we not get that here? I don't know, but it would be a great idea, right? I would stop at McDonald's on my way home if I could get tiramisu there. Who am I kidding? I'm probably stopping there anyway. My burger at the McDonald's in Savigliano was a burger with onions, lettuce, tomatoes, and pear sauce. Pear sauce, a common condiment that they put on burgers there. My fries at the McDonald's in Italy, they serve fries drenched in melted cheddar and bacon bits. And they also, so one of the things about the Italian McDonald's is they love to make it an experience, and they want it to kind of vaguely resemble going to a local coffee shop. It's like a coffee shop experience. So unlike most McDonald's where you go in and you get out fairly quickly, they actually expect people to linger there. And so when they serve you fries, they give you these little stabby sticks, these little long stabby sticks, and you can stab like one fry. If you're really talented, you can get 2 fries on the stabby stick at once. So this encourages people to eat the fries slowly and just enjoy that juicy, cheesy, bacony goodness. And of course, wrapped up the meal with the macaroon. So that was my trip to McDonald's in Italy. So in conclusion, where do we go from here? There are a couple of questions that I'd like to pose. We're not going to answer them tonight. They may be unanswerable given the data that we have at this time, but I think they're interesting to ponder. But I've posed a number of questions for discussion / pondering them on your own a little bit later. Number one is globalization losing steam? Is globalization losing steam? A variety of economic indicators suggest that the answer might actually be yes. For example, there's a recent report from the World Trade Organization that showed that the volume of global merchandise trade, in other words, basically the trade in things, physical things, actually declined sharply during the pandemic year of 2020. I know you could say, okay, well, that's the pandemic. Everything was crazy. Everything was off kilter then. It did recover after the pandemic, but then it declined again, albeit modestly, in 2023. There's also the question of whether or not individual state actors, in other words, governments, are going to do what is needed in order to maintain globalized systems. We have seen, particularly over the last year or two, the rise of populist nationalist political movements all around the country, many of which are predicated on an explicit rejection of globalization in all of its forms. And so it may well be the case that the very governments, including the one we have here, that have championed this globalized economic system and brought it into being, may be in the process of abandoning it. And so, can globalization survive if state actors no longer support it? We'll be skeptical of that. And if so, if it is losing steam, what then? Some analysts suggest that the next big trend will be regionalization. Basically, advanced economies are going to reshore or nearshore. And you read a lot of business news over the last year or two, the terms reshoring and nearshoring have been used a lot to describe trends in especially corporate organization. Corporations have been basically moving a lot of business processes that used to be overseas, either back home or to countries that are closer to them. So in this model, the United States may become more closely integrated with like Canada, also Mexico, possibly parts of Central and South America, but less integrated with, say, South Asia and East Asia. Right? Will that happen? I don't. If that is happening, we're on the cusp of it. Just at the beginning, we don't really know for sure, but it's a definite possibility. And then the last question is, can the cultural impacts of globalization survive if the economic system breaks down? In other words, if we are no longer doing business with the rest of the world at the same pace and at the same to the same degree or the same volume as we have in the past, are we going to continue sharing common forms of art, music, literature, ideas, values? Are we going to be sharing our culture the same way? Or is cultural globalization going to go the way of the dodo as well? What do you all think? I'm done talking. You tell me.
At the very beginning, you said globalization is here and it's not going to go away.
Well, did I say it's not going to go away?
That's what I interpreted.
Well, I think I might have meant something more along the lines of it doesn't appear to be going away anytime. And to be clear, it's not like we're going to stop. The whole world isn't going to stop trading with each other anymore. The new paradigm, according to some analysts, might be more regionalization or localization, where you're trading with a handful of partners as opposed to dozens and dozens of partners around the world. So it's not like international trade is not going to vanish, but we might become less reliant on it than we have been in the past. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
And that's a hypothesis. We really have to wait and see if that's going to come to pass. If you want to read a great book that discusses the whole concept of deglobalization, as it's called, it's a book by a geopolitical analyst, guy by the name of Peter Zeihan. It's The End of the World is Just the Beginning. And it's all about the phenomenon of deglobalization, which he thinks is going to basically dominate the next generation. But we'll see. We'll see. Yes.
What's the role of the supply chain issue that happened during the pandemic, do you think, on this deglobalization, where companies couldn't get parts to continue building full products?
I think the pandemic had a massive impact on it, without question. Which is why, also when the pandemic ended, we saw the volume of international trade rebound. But at the same time, may have exposed some underlying weaknesses within the system, because again, we saw another dip in 2023, particularly in the wake of the Russia-Ukrainian war, which disrupted global energy markets and also global food chains. Russia and Ukraine, I think, are number 4 don't quote me on this, but I think they're number 4 and number 5 in wheat exports around the world. So together they account for just a massive amount of the world's cereal production. And obviously, as Ukrainian exports have been interrupted and as Russian exports have been disrupted by sanctions, obviously that's had a pretty significant impact. If you follow international politics, particularly over the last year and a half, one of the striking things that you notice is that incumbent parties have been losing everywhere. Incumbent parties have been losing everywhere, whether they're right wing or left wing. They've been in power for the last 12 to 18 months. They've been dead. It's true in Britain, true in India, true in South Korea, true in Japan, true in the United States as well. And a large part of that has been the result of worldwide inflation. It's a global phenomenon, and it has roiled world of international trade. It's also roiled world of international politics. If I had to guess, I'd say that we're just at the beginning of that. I don't think these trends are going away anytime soon. Any other? Go ahead.
Just quickly, 60 years ago when I was in college, we would have these debates about globalization, and the feeling was in the college that I was in, it's a good thing because it will make everybody dependent on everybody else and less chance of wars. And of course, we were not that far.
That was the promise.
So what happened?
It ended up not being true. There's a really funny concept in foreign policy circles called the McDonald's theory of conflict prevention. How many of you have heard of it? Basically, it was the idea that you've heard of it because I mentioned it in class. It's basically the idea that no two countries that both have a McDonald's have ever gone to war with one another. And it was true for like 25 or 30 years. It ended when the United States bombed Serbia, because there was a McDonald's. There were a couple of McDonald's locations in Serbia. Then obviously it's proven to be untrue ever since then. There were McDonald's in both Russia and Ukraine, for example. So economic interdependence has ultimately not canceled out human nature, which is driven to a large degree by fear and greed and in-group and out-group prejudices and hostilities. The desire for my tribe or my group have preeminence or control over others. Those elements of human nature have remained the same. And it's a real pity because, and this just kind of confesses some of my ideological priors. I'm a bit of a globalist myself, not in the sense of like believing in global government, but definitely in the sense of believing in free trade around the world. And I do believe that globalization has had a pretty significant impact in, as I showed, reducing global poverty rates, lifting millions of people to a decent standard of living that they could not have imagined 40 or 50 years ago. But to keep it going, people have to be willing to do so. People have to be willing to cooperate. And they have to be willing to put other priorities besides just making money and helping their people live a life. They have to be willing to put other priorities aside. And it also matters if the political leadership are willing to do that. Vladimir Putin, obviously not willing to do that. Russia has lost so much money. Their economy has been devastated. I haven't prepared any of the statistics, but I could show you the statistics that show, overall GDP, per capita GDP, standard interest rates have gone as high as 20%. It's almost impossible for ordinary people to buy a house there. And yet he's persistent in waging this cruel and illegal war on Ukraine. It doesn't make sense economically. But dollars and cents or rubles ultimately aren't the only factors driving political behavior. Yes.
Going off what that man said, doesn't globalism act as a shield though for certain countries that are more valuable? Like Taiwan produces 90% of the world's computer chips. And that's probably a big reason why they haven't been attacked or tried to be like reinvaded by China, because the entire world depends on that little island producing everyone's computer
It's
chips.
certainly, that's a really great question, Brendan, and it's certainly a huge part of the reason why a lot of other Western developed countries seem willing to have Taiwan's back for now. However, we are in the process of, again, reshoring the chip making industry back to the United States. There's a giant chip factory going up in Phoenix, just down the road. And my suspicion is that once we've reshored that capacity, then the willingness of the US government, and I think this would have been true regardless of the outcome of the last election, the willingness of the US government to take risks on behalf of tiny little island democracy in the South China Sea would eventually have dissipated. Unfortunately, I suspect it will dissipate. I have any Taiwanese listeners? I'm sorry. I'm not saying that that should be the case. I'm saying I think that's probably what will happen. Yes.
From the chat, I'll pull it up here.
After the COVID. Okay. Comet, globalization, more sense than before. I guess the short answer to your question, Jeremy, wherever you're coming from, the short answer to your question would be yes, if people's behavior were being driven solely by rational economic considerations. But again, I don't believe that rational economic self-interest is the only factor driving people's behavior, especially their political behavior. If it were, I suspect we'd be seeing very different policies coming out of governments all around, including the US. Any other questions?
This one's a bit simpler than the other ones, but on one of your slides, I think the first one about the McDonaldization theory, you had 4 reasons why it was so popular, and one of them was calculability. Why is that one so fun?
Calculability is basically, we'll go back to that slide here. Basically measuring everything. So in McDonaldized systems, according to Reitzer, and McDonaldized systems exist beyond just the fast food industry. We see them everywhere. Walmart, we could very easily call McDonaldization Walmartization. But in McDonaldized system, sorry, it's late, so I have mush mouth right now. In McDonaldized systems, everything has to get measured. You have to know you have to know how much syrup to buy for the soda machines, and also how much you're using on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. You have to know how many buns to order. You have to know how many patties to order on a daily and weekly basis. So you take meticulous measurements of how much you're selling, also how much you're wasting, right? Because wastage is a common feature of any fast food chain restaurant. You have to, if you're going to give a discount, you have to know how many people are taking advantage of the discount in order to know if it makes sense. What else are they buying? So calculability, that's calculability, essentially. Measuring things in order to ensure point number 1, which is greater efficiency. Does that make sense? Any other? Yes? Oh, sorry, I thought I saw a hand. Let me pose, go ahead.
I was gonna mention as an aside, there was an interesting segment on CBS 60 Minutes last night, which essentially was the effect of globalization on Bhutan of all places. and how globalization has influenced them to such an extent that a lot of younger educated people are leaving the country to pursue better
Absolutely.
economic possibilities in other countries.
And we see that in a lot of developing countries, especially developing countries that have reasonably good educational systems. Now, I don't know a lot about Bhutan particularly. I do know a little bit more about the Philippines. Some of you who've attended Comet talks with, or had classes with me before know, because I talk about it, I'm part Filipino, quarter Filipino on my dad's side. My grandfather, Santiago, came from the islands in the 30s. Philippines has an excellent educational system. It was built up during the American period when the United States had control of the islands. So it's very much based on the American university system model. What they don't have is a lot of great economic infrastructure or the resources, financial resources and legal resources in place in order to build successful enterprises there. And so as a result, you see a lot of brain drain. You see a lot of, they churn out well-educated, qualified, professional class people, especially in the healthcare fields, which is why Filipino doctors and also nurses go all around the world, including the United States. U.S. has 4 million Filipinos living, making it the #1 destination for Filipinos around the world. And they come here because there's jobs, because the skill sets that they acquire over there are more marketable here. And so, you know, that is, now, it's not like the Philippines doesn't get anything out of this. There's also remittances, because people tend to send money back to support their family and loved ones back home. And that's actually one of the island's major sources of income. I would hazard a guess that probably Bhutan experiences something similar. They probably get a lot of money in remittances from their overseas foreign workers. But that would just be a guess on it. So.